George Washington was in a very unique situation in terms of world history in 1796. He was about to complete his second term as the president of a colony that had won its independence from its overseer, and it was widely accepted that if he were to seek a third term, he would probably win. And to the world's surprise, he chose to step aside and retire from public life. He had observed many things in his second term that he wanted to warn the young United States about. The address was printed on September 19th, 1796, and it warns us against the very things he was beginning to see form in his second administration. You can still hear Washington's warnings to this very second. Now, Washington would touch on a variety of topics, and I want to take a look at each one of them. I'm going to read passages from his 32-page speech, tell you what was going on at the time in his administration and in the United States, and then relay each of them to you and how they relate to us today. So let's begin at the beginning of his speech. In looking forward to the moment which is intended to terminate the career of my public life, my feelings do not permit me to suspend the deep acknowledgement of that debt of gratitude which I owe to my beloved country for the many honors it has conferred upon me, still more for the steadfast confidence which it has supported me, and for the opportunities I have thence enjoyed of manifesting my inviolable attachment by services faithful and persevering, though in usefulness unequal to my zeal. He then continues, Here perhaps I ought to stop, but a solicitude for your welfare which cannot end but with my life, and the apprehension of danger, natural that solicitude urged me, on an occasion like the present, to offer your solemn contemplation, and to recommend your frequent review some sentiments which are the result of much reflection, of no incomprehensible observation, and which appear to me all important to the permanency of your felicity as a people. These will be offered to you with the more freedom, as you can only see in them the disinterested warnings of a parting friend, who can possibly have no personal motive to the bias his counsel. Nor can I forget, as an encouragement to it, your indulgent reception of my sentiments on a former and not dissimilar occasion. That one's pretty simple. He's thanking the American people for allowing him to serve, but as a parting friend, he wants to warn the American people of what he has seen. I feel like we should probably first, though, start out with something that he saw as a positive. For this you have every inducement of sympathy and interest. Citizens, by birth or choice, or of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. With slight shades of difference, you have the same religion, manners, habits, and political principles. You have in a common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of a joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, sufferings, and successes. He's talking about patriotism, right? He's saying that you should all see yourself as American. You all share the same principles, and this is a pretty big highlight of his speech, and something that we will touch on in the next point, which is the first negative point of Washington's speech, and it is something that he calls factions, or what we call today, parties. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of a party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misinterpretations. They tend to render alien to each other those who fought to be bound together by fraternal affection. Washington then goes on further in the speech, continuing on factions. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its roots in the strongest passions of the human mind. It exists under different shapes in all government, more or less stifled, controlled, or oppressed, but in those of the popular form it is seen in its great rankness and is truly their worst enemy. The alternative domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it an interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. It serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus the policy and will of one country are subject to the policy and will of another. Wow, how powerful is that? And it's fairly easy to understand what Washington is trying to warn against there. He's warning against the formation of parties and how it could potentially divide the nation. And this actually became very obvious that it was happening in the second Washington administration. There was already two different parties that had formed, the Federalists, which the second president John Adams would be, and the Democratic Republicans, which were led by Thomas Jefferson. The split of American parties would continue all the way up until the Civil War, when the North and the South split. Today, I think the current election cycle might be the most decisive that the party system has seen. And I'd be interested to see what you guys think, because we've had quite a bit of what Washington explained in that last passage. And next, Washington also touches on the economy, which was another hot topic in his administration. Let's see what he says. As a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertion in time of peace to discharge the debts which avoidable wars may have been occasioned, but not ungenerously throwing upon the posterity the burden which we ought ourselves to bear. To facilitate to them the performance of their duty, it is essential that you should be practically bear in mind that towards the payments of debts there must be revenue, that to have revenue there must be taxes, that no taxes can be devised which are not more or less inconvenient and unpleasant. That is intrinsic embarrassment, inseparable from the selection of proper objects, which is always a choice of difficulties, ought to be a decisive motive for a candid construction and the conduct of the government in the making, and for a spirit of acquiescence in the measures for obtaining revenue which the public exigencies may at any time dictate. The major economic action during Washington's administration was the founding of the National Bank, and was fought very heatedly between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Today, that passage relates to trade agreements and the movement of U.S. jobs overseas. The collection of debt is a different thing entirely. There have been very few times in U.S. history when the United States didn't have any debt. And I think the economic policies in the world changed drastically since Washington's speech. However, I think we would all agree that the current level of U.S. debt is quite outrageous. Washington took another large portion of the address to take a look at what he thought on the U.S. foreign policy and how it should continue in the future. In the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than the permanent, inveterable antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachment for others should be excluded, and that in place of them, just and amicable feelings towards all should be cultivated. The nation which indulges towards another a habitual hatred or habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to his animosity or its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. Antipathy in one nation against another disposes each more readily to offer insult and injury, to lay hold of slight causes of umbrage, and to be haughty and intractable, when accidental or trifling occasions of dispute occur. Hence the frequent collisions, obstinate, envenomed, and bloody contests. The nation, prompted by ill will and resentment, sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. Washington then continues, so likewise, a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation, facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into participating in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. It also leads to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others, which is apt to doubly to injure the nation making the concessions, by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained, and by exciting jealousy, ill will, and a disposition to retaliate, in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. And it gives to ambitious, corrupted, and deluded citizens, who devote themselves to the favorite nation, facility to betray or sacrifice the interests of their own countries, without odium, sometimes even with popularity, gliding with the appearances of a virtuous sense of obligation, a commendable deference for public opinion, or a laudable zeal for public good. The base of foolishness, compliances of ambition, corruption, or infatuation. As avenues to foreign influence, in innumerable ways, such attachments are particularly alarming to the truly enlightened and independent patriot. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead the public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils. Such an attachment of a small or weak towards a great or powerful nation dooms the former to be a satellite of the latter. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided, instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for foreign nation and excessive dislike of another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side, and to serve the vow of second arts of influence on the other. Real patriots who may resist the intrigues of the favorite are liable to become the suspected and odious, while its tools and dupes usurp the applause and confidence of the people to surrender their interests. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations, to have them with us as little political connection as possible. So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with good health. Here let us stop. Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none, or very remote relation. Hence she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Henceforth it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary vicissitudes of her politics, or the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendships or enemies. Washington then continues, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance without any portion of the foreign world, so far, I mean, as we know at liberty to do it. For let me not be understood as capable of patronizing infidelity to existing engagements. I hold the maxim no less applicable to the public than private affairs, that honestly is always the best policy. I repeat it, therefore, let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, but in my opinion it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them. Taking care always to keep ourselves by suitable establishments on a respectable defensive posture, we must safely trust to temporary alliance for extraordinary emergencies. Another one that's pretty simple. Neutrality, right? The nation needed to stabilize itself. Don't get involved in those European conflicts that they keep fighting non-stop, year after year. And there actually have been several different points in U.S. history when a policy of neutrality was taken. Most recently, the beginning of the 20th century, and the delayed entry into the First and Second World Wars. Today, however, the U.S. is a global superpower with troops in more nations than most Americans probably know exist. There is, however, a percentage of the U.S. population that wants to return back to the days of splendid isolationism. I wanted to end off today's video with the last paragraph of this address because it is very, very beautiful, and you can really get a sense of how Washington truly felt about his service to the American people. So let's take a look. Though in reviewing the incidents of my administration, I am unconscious of intentional error, I am nevertheless too sensible of my defects not to think it probable that I have committed many errors. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that, after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest. Relying on its kindness in this as in other things, and actuated by that fervent love towards it, which is so natural to a man who views in it the native soil of himself and his progenitors for several generations, I anticipate with pleasing expectation that retreat in which I promise myself to realize, without alloy, the sweet enjoyment of partaking, in the midst of my fellow citizens, the benign influence of good laws under a free government, the ever-favorite subject of my heart, and the happy reward, as I trust, of our mutual cares, labors, and dangers.